Good morning and welcome back to I Survived Mount St. Helens. So we thought last left them. It was Sam, Jess, and Eddie. Remember, Sam and Eddie are the twins. Jess is the girl. And they went to the cabin or the shack looking for the skeleton woman. Remember, there was a curse, so they got challenged or double dared or whatever you call it from a classmate in school. So they just came upon the shack. Here we go, Chapter 5. Yikes, Eddie muttered. The small cabin looked like nobody had stepped foot inside in years. The porch sagged, the windows were boarded up, and the chimney had crumbled to bits. Thick, twisting vines crawled up the sides. It was easy to imagine two deadly eyes peering through the cracks in the wood. Jess could practically hear a croaking voice whispering to her, "Give me your bones." Jess's muscles twitched. All she wanted was to get away from here. But then she pictured Missy's smirk. "Don't be a dope," Jess told herself. There was no such thing as Skeleton Woman, but all too real Missy would be waiting for them at school on Monday morning. Jess gathered her courage and stepped forward. Sam and Eddie glued themselves to her side. Together, they moved through the tangled brush, pushing through the thorny bushes that grabbed at their clothes. "Skeleton Woman is not real. Skeleton Woman is not real." Jess said these words over and over to herself. But just to be safe, she scanned the group for traps. She remembered that detail from the old legend, how Skeleton Woman dug big pits in the ground to trap her victims. The holes were as deep as graves. She'd cover the pits with branches and leaves and wait for helpless victims to tumble to their doom. "Skeleton Woman is not real. Skeleton Woman is not real." Sam reached for the door first and gave it a little push. Creak. The door swung open. Jess braced herself for a hideous scream, for two rusty-clawed hands to reach out and pull her into the darkness. But wait, it didn't look so scary. A buttery ray of sunlight beamed through the crack in the roof. There was a battered table and chair and some cardboard boxes of junk. A paintbrush and a can splattered with red paint sat on a shelf. There were no baskets of bones, no cauldrons of bubbling witch's brew. It was just an abandoned hunting shack, like hundreds of others that dotted the forests around here. They all stepped inside and looked around. "So hurry up and take the picture," Eddie said. "Okay," Jess said, shrugging off her backpack. She opened it up and took the big black camera out of its plastic bag. The sight of it sent a little jab through her heart. It reminded her so much of her dad. She put her backpack on the floor and lifted the camera, aiming it at the room. But then a strange noise filled the shack. The hairs on the back of Jess's neck stood up straight. What was that? Her whole body started to shake. Her teeth rattled. But it wasn't her fear that was making her shake. The whole cabin was vibrating. The walls trembled and the floor rolled up and down under their feet. Jess staggered and fell to her knees. Dad's camera slipped from her hands and flew across the floor. What was happening? "Skeleton Woman is not real. Skeleton Woman is not real." But if it wasn't Skeleton Woman, who or what was it? "It's the curse!" Sam screamed. I actually have a funny story about Jenna with it's not real, it's not real. So remind me in the morning meeting and I'll tell you. I kind of forget what the story is. I feel like this is a mystery or a kind of a scary mystery, but it's not. Think of the title and be inferring what you think that rumble was. Chapter 6. They stumbled out of the cabin, but the shaking out was outside, too. The ground buckled up and down. The trees swayed back and forth violently. Jess and the boys clung to each other for balance as they staggered to the trail. But then the crash! A huge tree fell right in front of them. They turned to escape in the other direction, but crash! A massive limb hit the ground just feet from where they stood. They had to get out of here. "Wait! My dad's camera!" Jess shouted. But there was no going back. The ground was now splitting apart like ice breaking on a frozen pond. Clouds of dirt flew up. Yawning holes opened in the earth, some deeper than any grave. Jess and the twins huddled close together, their heads ducked down low, their arms wrapped tight around each other. More tree limbs crashed to the ground. Jess braced herself for the crushing blow of a huge branch hitting her head. And then, in a blink, the shaking stopped. The forest went mute. The only sounds were their own sobbing breaths. They stood there too shocked and scared to speak. And then, without a word, they joined hands and ran down the trail. They jumped over fallen branches and holes in the ground, over roots and rocks. Jess kept looking over her shoulder, sure that the skeleton woman was after them. She could practically feel the witch's oven breath huffing at her back. Missy had been right all along. This forest was cursed. They were almost to the parking lot when they heard Mr. Rowan shouting for them. He came rushing up the trail, moving his burly body way faster than Jess ever thought he could. He grabbed all three of them in a bear hug. They hadn't yet caught their breath when a man came hurrying up to them. He had dark brown skin and curly hair and looked to be about Mom's age. "Hey, are you all okay?" Jess and the twins peeled themselves away from Mr. Rowan. "We're all in one piece," Mr. Rowan called out. "You?" "I'm fine," the man said, dusting off his pants. "That was a pretty strong quake." "Sure was," Mr. Rowan answered. Jess and the twins stared at each other in shock and relief. An earthquake? Of course. Earthquakes happen sometimes in Washington state. They even had earthquake drills at school. They'd been so brainwashed by Missy's dumb story that they weren't thinking clearly. Mr. Rowan introduced himself to the man. "Skip Rowan," he said. "Tim Morales," the man said, shaking Mr. Rowan's hand and smiling warmly at the twins and Jess. "Do you have a cabin here, Tim?" Mr. Rowan asked. "Actually, I'm here for work," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket and taking out a business card, which he handed to Mr. Rowan. "Dr. Timothy Morales," Mr. Rowan read. "Department of Seismology, University of Washington. You study earthquakes? Well, you came to the right place today." Dr. Morales nodded. "Actually, we've detected at least 50-mile earthquakes in this area, all in this past week. They're coming from directly under St. Helens. At first, we weren't sure what these earthquakes meant, but now we're certain they're warning signs." "Warning of what?" Mr. Rowan asked. Dr. Morales was quiet for a moment, and then he looked up at St. Helens. And what he said next was more unbelievable than any horror story Jess had ever heard. "I think Miss Mount St. Helens is about to erupt." My computer is doing something. Remember the Ring of Fire? We studied those volcanoes. Washington's on the Pacific Ocean, and the Ring of Fire comes down from Alaska and down the west coast of the United States, where Washington, Oregon, and California are. So, Chapter 7. 60 minutes later, Clive's Diner, Cedar, Washington. Jess and the twins and Mr. Rowan walked through the front door of Clive's. Mom took one look at them and nearly dropped the coconut cake she was carrying. Jess knew they must look bad, streaked with dirt and covered with scratches from their run down the mountain. "What on earth?" Mom cried, putting the cake on the counter and hurrying over to them. Mom listened with wide eyes as they told her about the quake. She wrapped her arms around Jess and hugged her tight. Jess opened her mouth ready to tell her about Dad's camera, but then Mr. Rowan announced the big news. "We heard that St. Helens might erupt." Mom stared at him in shock. "That's ridiculous," she said. "Who would say such a thing?" A voice from the end of the counter called out, "I would." Mom had been so busy fussing over Jess and the twins that she hadn't noticed Dr. Morales, who had walked in behind them. Mr. Rowan had invited him to join everyone at Clive's, and he had followed them down the highway in his car, that beat-up Toyota they had spotted in the parking lot. Turned out that living through the earthquake made people fast friends. "Tim here is a volcano expert," Mr. Rowan said. "He works at a lab in Seattle." Mom looked Dr. Morales up and down with surprise. "You're a scientist?" With his overgrown curls and faded jeans, Dr. Morales looked more like a singer in a rock band than a person who worked in a laboratory. "I'm not wearing my scientist uniform today," Dr. Morales laughed. "But yes, I've been studying St. Helens for the past 8 years. Mom sent Jess and the twins to get cleaned up. When they returned, they found Mom and the men sitting in a booth. There were mugs of hot chocolate waiting for Jess and the boys. There were no other customers in the diner, so Mom was free to sit with them. "But I didn't think St. Helens could erupt," Mom said. "I didn't either," Mr. Rowan said. "I figured it was kind of a volcano that's dead, or whatever the word is." "You mean extinct," Dr. Morales said. "But no, St. Helens is not extinct. It's just been dormant, which means it's been quiet." "But it's always been so peaceful," Mom said. "It has been perfectly quiet for 123 years, Dr. Morales said. "The last time it erupted was in 1857. But St. Helens is the most active volcano in the West. It has erupted dozens of times over the past few hundred years. There have been massive explosions, lava flows, avalanches, and mudslides. One eruption about 500 years ago buried much of the valley under 200 feet of rock and ash and mud. What about Cedar? Mom asked. Cedar is up on a ridge, and I don't think any of the eruptions have reached this far. It's a safe place. Good, Mom said with a nervous smile. I was about to start packing up. Amazing that nobody around here knows all about all this, Mr. Bowen said, shaking his head. Actually, people did know, Dr. Morales said. Native Americans had been living here in the Cascades for about 7,000 years before the American settlers arrived. They knew St. Helens was dangerous and stayed away from it. They wouldn't even fish from the lakes on the mountain. The Cowlitz tribe called this mountain Lawalatala. It means mountain of fire. The word seemed to hang in the air. What's the most dangerous part of an eruption? Mom asked. Lava, said Sam, with just a little too much excitement. Lava is dangerous, said Mr. Morales, but around here the bigger dangers are mudslides and rock avalanches. And I worry about the pyroclastic surge. That's a wave of hot air that explodes out of the volcano. It's truly devastating. That's what happened in the eruption of Mount Pelée. I don't even know if that's right. I never heard of Mount Pelée, Mr. Rowan said. None of them had. What happened? Eddie asked. I don't know if you want to hear about that, Dr. Morales said. It's a grim story. We do, Sam begged. Go ahead, Mom. Go ahead, said Mom. And so as the hot chocolates grew cold, Dr. Morales told the story of the deadliest volcanic eruption in the 20th century. All right. Whoops. All right. Chapter 8. The year was 1902 on the Caribbean island of Martinique, Dr. Morales began. The island's capital is the city of Saint-Pierre, which is right on the Caribbean Sea, and it sits right at the base of Mount Pelée. Pelée was a fairy tale of kind of mountains with bright green slopes covered with trees. Like St. Helens, Jess thought. Few people realized that it was actually a volcano. It had rumbled a few times over the centuries, but it had been silent for more than 50 years. And then, in April of 1902, Pelée woke up. All through that month, there were hundreds of very small earthquakes. Like the ones today? Eddie asked. Dr. Morales nodded. There was also the strong smell of sulfur gas seeping from deep inside the earth. That gas builds up as a volcano is becoming more active, and it can leak out of the earth. It has a horrific smell, like rotten eggs. Around Pelée, the stench became so strong that people fainted in the streets, and horses collapsed. But few had any idea that the quakes and the sulfur were warning signs that Pelée was going to erupt. The science of volcanoes was unknown back then. People simply didn't understand that they were in danger. That changed in early May, when a small eruption sent ash and glowing rocks into the air. A few days later, part of the volcano broke away, and a river of boiling mud and ash roared down the mountain at 80 miles an hour. That's faster than my truck, Mr. Rowan said. Some mudslides can travel even faster. That one killed more than 150 people, Dr. Morales said. He looked at Jess and the twins. The story gets more grisly. Maybe I should stop here. No, Sam shouted. For him, this was even better than a Mariners game. Dr. Morales looked at Mom, who nodded. Okay, he said, because next time come the snakes. Snakes? Mom said. The earthquakes disturbed thousands of snakes that had been living on the mountain. They came slithering down into St. Pierre. Some of them were venomous 6-foot-long pit vipers. Hundreds of people died from bites. Goodness, I'm going to have nightmares about this, Mom said. Sorry, Dr. Morales said. I'm getting carried away. I should stop. But no way would Sam let him. It's all right, Mom said. You might as well tell us how this ends. I think we can take it, Mr. Rowan agreed. So, at this point, people were terrified, as you can imagine, Dr. Morales continued. Many people left by ship, but most couldn't afford to flee or had no place to go, and the leaders of St. Pierre kept telling people the worst was over. I'm guessing they were wrong, Mom said with a cringe. Very wrong, Dr. Morales said. The real disaster happened on May 8th. A cloud of sulfur blanketed the city. First, there was a massive explosion. Pumice and mud rained down, and then a wave of searing hot gas and ash exploded out of the mountain and into St. Pierre. Dr. Morales took a breath. Within seconds, 30,000 people were dead. Jess gasped, and the boys' chins practically hit the table. 30,000 people, Mom said slowly. How is that even possible? That was the pyroclastic surge. Imagine the wind in a hurricane, but with the air that's scalding hot. Then add toxic gas and ground up rock and ash. The heat is so extreme that it burns everything in its path. People died instantly, without even knowing what happened to them. Nobody spoke for a moment, and even Sam looked queasy. The only sound was the gurgle of the soda fountain. And you're saying that same thing could happen here? Mom asked. Dr. Morales nodded. It could, but luckily there aren't 30,000 people living right at the base of St. Helens. That was true. The mountains were surrounded by forests with just a few towns dotting the valley. A chill came over Jess, even though she was warm and snug sitting between the twins. For her entire life, St. Helens had been the beautiful mountain rising into the sky. She had grown up hiking its winding trails, diving into its cold lakes, and fishing for trout in its streams. Just looking at St. Helens out her window made her feel calm, as if it were watching over her somehow. Okay, maybe somewhere in the back of her mind she had known that St. Helens was a volcano. Everyone here must know that. But Jess never imagined that it was a real volcano, a killer that could explode. When do you think the eruption's going to happen? Mom asked. Dr. Morales shook his head. It's hard to say for sure, but I do believe it's going to erupt violently, and I think it's going to happen soon. And I guess we'll have to wait and see. All right, have a good day.